Hello, welcome to another episode of Wing Zero Symphonics. On this episode, we're going to touch on that of which is quite simply complex, and that is martial arts, okay? Martial arts. And where to begin with martial arts? I suppose we can either begin with the entire history of humankind's approach to martial arts, or we can begin with the human being, my introduction into martial arts. I had done karate as a kid, and it was a form called Goju Ryu. And as a kid, I really didn't know the entire history of martial arts, right? But I had played a few video games that included martial arts to some degree. And I was a kid who liked playing sports, like playing outside. And so it was a cool opportunity with some friends to get involved. And it was fun. It was fun. It was a good time. And it was both fun as well as personally liberating to a certain degree. As personally liberating as someone in my age at the time, at pre-adolescence around there, could say for themselves that they feel. At the same time, I discovered music. I got really into music. And so it was a great combination. My academics were great, martial arts were great, music was fulfilling, and I had, that's generally when it comes to my life at the time. Eventually, my interest in karate waned a bit because turning into a teenager brought certain challenges that I felt that karate was not going to meet. Now, that's not to say that there are not millions of people, of karate practitioners, who feel greatly motivated, greatly inspired, greatly fulfilled by the practice of that art. So we continue on. Martial arts was not a part of my life at all throughout my teenage years, well into my 20s, until around my late 20s. So what's important to note about why it is martial arts became a factor in my life again has to do with essentially looking at the history of mankind and finding that the entirety of its history is contained within oneself. In essence, one is the world in all of its symbolic representations, all of its history, all of its truths, all of its lies, all of its purposes, the whole shebang. So that lends towards the first observation as to whether we begin with looking at martial arts as a whole. Right? People can write entire books on the history of martial arts, ranging from old Indian civilization, martial arts, who knows, right? China has more of a recorded and lengthier history, how that expanded out across the Asian continents, and then, of course, European types of all sorts of combat throughout history. It's entirety of mankind has sought to understand through a craft that can defeat an opponent. Okay, and so when coming upon martial arts now, I had caught wind that there was a martial artist. You may have heard of this martial artist. You may have seen him in the movies. You may see him on t-shirts and posters, and internet memes, and all sorts of silly stuff like that, right? There was a martial artist who also discovered for themselves that the entirety of mankind, its knowledge, memory, experience is contained within oneself, that it's not separate from oneself. Right? That the experiencer is experienced. That the thinker is the thought. However you want to put it. And the observer is the observed. Okay? And so this martial artist was like, Why waste energy trying to separate within this knowledge, memory, and experience of martial arts, when the entirety of it is ultimately self-knowledge? Interesting. You see, this notion that's getting across here is obviously one, if you're watching this, you may have never ever considered in your lifetime. Okay, you may be someone who has sought to gather knowledge, memory, and experience, analyze within it, and identify with it. Okay? And that's the way it is. That's the way things should be. That's the way things have always been. And that there is no such freedom from the constant identification with thought, something that's not locally real, but obviously plays a root role in why it is that violence is going to break out anyways. And it's a given. The status quo of the human being, rest assured, violence is taking place all around the globe at any given time. It could range from unarmed combat all the way to autonomous vehicles, flying vehicles that drop payloads of bombs of all sorts, like a computer controlled from a screen. So violence and the fragmentation of self within oneself, a thinker being separate from thought, that there is some sort of center in relation to thought, which indicates the me, or the self, and that humanity has gone ahead and categorized itself for safety, not only physical safety, but psychological safety within groups of like-mindedness. And this like-mindedness then passes down tradition, style, and it becomes the gospel truth as to the way. But hey, comes along so-and-so, and they have another way. And so the human being has fragmented itself, not only inwardly, but outwardly. And so there is constant friction, constant friction in the daily life. So, going back to this martial art. So, by the time I was a teenager, the desire to be a fundamentally different human being was planted, that seed. And it didn't seem very realistic to do as such, to be as such. Remember, I'd grown up conditioned. From family, friends, the internet, got on the internet, and whoa, knowledge, memory, and experience all throughout. And a separation as to them being there, because they're there on the screen, right? The successful person on the screen. Whoa, turn on the screen. And this human being who is not. So the question became whether the human being can fundamentally change. So, hey, I'm going to make it happen. So throughout my my first emphasis as a teenager was spot on. Okay. But to maintain that, no. Peer pressure was going to be way too strong. Right? Tribes, groups, like-mindedness. Okay? Identifying with thought. I am a this, I am a that. I must be a this, I must be a that. You are this, you are that. So then you are this, you are that. Okay. All day, every day. That's our education, which teaches us to sharpen this tool of the ego that can create an artificial separation to categorize or label or whatever kind of other exercise in futility. But the status quo is that that's the way it is, and there's no other way to go about this thing called living. Living with safety, order, intelligence, right? And of course, without violence. So my teen years was at my early 20s is like, how the heck is this really going to, can I be an artist? Perhaps as an artist, maybe an actor or musician, this could find its way, because it's the professional people are not going to get this. This is not something that's in the line of sight for serious professional people who are within a system and depend on the system to provide them the success. And so it's not a political ideology, it's not a religious, spiritual ideology, it's not a intellectual pursuit, it's not philosophical. So then what sort of approach will it take for the human being to get as intimate as possible within oneself? As seriously as one can. To fundamentally change oneself, because that's all that one has in one's control. Only oneself, that's it. And even that, then, that control can be looked into. What exactly does that mean by that? But for purposes of practicality, you see, a language breaks down at a certain point, and most people cannot look beyond the word, or read between the lines. Where do we learn that? We don't learn that in school. We don't learn that at university. We don't learn that in medical school, law school, physics masters, engineering, computer coding. That's not anywhere. No philosophy is going to give you that in its rawest form. Because there are the thought leaders who are going to tell you, think for yourself, this and that, the other. But once we start getting into a little bit of what it is that I like to, question with, give a little jab with, a little something, a little program with, you'll see that if that they haven't gone deeper than knowledge, memory, experience. No, not for 1 minute. Why? No one's going to buy into. No one's going to. The internet. The internet is what we're on right now. Okay. It's so fast paced that one needs to get it out, boom, quick. Knowledge, memory, and spirit is fast. Okay, so let's get to the point of this martial art. Well, to get to the point, first one has to see partiality for oneself. That's split within oneself. The fragmentation. I am on this side. You are on that side. Is the you, the image of the opponent, is that separate from the, let's say, the image-making process, the content of consciousness which makes up the psychological self? At some level, generally relative level, the separation between the two is not there. Okay, so we find ourselves then perhaps working together to some degree, right? Which is where most people would put their most good faith effort. All right. They say, well, you believe this, I believe that. And we can see the commonalities and we can get along to a certain degree. But at a certain degree, you go this way and I go that way. And then there is, right? So we're going through the points, right? There is the stage in which the human being finds that there is no separation anywhere to be found beyond the limited processing of thought itself, as well as there being no self, no psychological self beyond that processing itself. So at this point then, the human being, you and me, you and I, ask ourselves, why do we carry on in such limited fashion, even though we find ourselves being able to some degree get along? When push comes to shove, when martial combat, when the separation within and without collapses, as it always has, right? We're not living this. Any place in the world is essentially not really what it was 100 years ago, 500 years ago, 1,000 years ago. Some of them have the same name, more or less, but it's a totally different game, more or less. There's a lot of decorations, ornaments, traditions. Remember that? Passed down. Remember those traditions? But the human brain has to work exponentially hard to maintain the symbolic representation outward, because it's continuously reiterating to itself and never able to get beyond between partiality, which is war, and fluidity, which is everyday life as it's been for a long time, roughly speaking. Now we have air conditioning, we have light, electricity, all right? And not to say that fluidity isn't something found more so than other places in the world. Okay, that degree of freedom is found in some places than others. Most places are some places are partiality, and live with it, deal with it. All right, that was human beings' experiences on this planet, unfortunately. So, why run the risk of this fluidity being still at a degree of separation? Why can't humanity take this next step into the pointlessness point? The pointless point. Emptiness. Or infinity. Let's say if you're a Kali man, there's a martial art, which is really the martial art of all martial arts. Let's face it, Filipino Kali. Okay, which not only draws from the historic aspects of China and India, and then it is let's say, modernized by Spanish, say, European influence, and a martial art which has faced the tribal conflict, continuously evolving, continuously discovering, and through unfortunate circumstances, well, that didn't work. Or, well, now look at Lapu Lapu now, or, yeah, don't do that. There's a finger missing, like that. Okay? Infinity is often the point we reach when we're discussing what kind of approach to understanding this martial art is. Infinity. An infinite number of ways of looking at it. They all fit in and fit out. They come in, they come out. The thing and its opposite. All right? In infinity. And since through infinity, with infinity, there's no boundary, there's no limit, there's no fixed point, there's no point of separation. Emptiness is the same. So, this martial art now is personally liberating in a way that the vast majority of humanity cannot say, that they've discovered for themselves. And the creator of this martial art, who I say is such for practical purposes, but if you listen to this martial artist or read a letter that he wrote to a magazine, he says very clearly that he did not create this martial art. He's not created anything new. You can imagine, emptiness and infinity is so fundamentally true. And the human brain is so far removed from that special quality, that space in between the words, missing out on efficiency as well as personal liberation. Is it possible to have both? Is it possible to have a freedom which brings an order and an order which brings a freedom? Because then at that point, like this martial artist once said to a Kali man, they were training and trying to get a technique down, and this martial artist said, "Oh, we're something along the lines. Who the heck knows what I'm talking about?" But the person is still alive. Who trained with this martial artist in the 50s, the 60s, and 70s. Something along the lines of, even though, so this martial artist trying to teach a technique to someone else, even if the other person didn't get the technique, you still just have the technique. Now the question is the technique both useful for obviously resolving for conflict outwardly, meaning two martial artists can come upon a technique and see for themselves, oh, I see how this is going to work in this matter. But also, does it resolve for the conflict inwardly? Such as spending an entire half of my life, so I'm in my early 30s now, about 15 years old, 15 to now, going around bringing up certain topics, certain inquiries, certain questions, certain observations that no one else is going to have for the first time they're hearing this stuff. They chalk it up to someone who's maybe not quite there, or interesting but not very, all the different kinds of excuses people make up to not discover for themselves, not see for themselves that the observer is the observed. Okay, until next time.